Thank you everybody for coming to this talk, this workshop. This is on Campaign Finance 101. I'm Nestor, as you'll see in a moment, and I just wanted to give a shout out here to the Kent Branch Library for hosting us here today and providing us with this wonderful smartboard. Let's get started here. Real quick about this presentation. This presentation is going to cover what campaign finance law is in Ohio, all the relevant stuff for a campaign. It's going to cover about 99% of what you need to know. I can't claim it's going to cover everything. It's not exhaustive. But you can use this if you're working on a candidate campaign or an issue campaign, or even if you're working for a political party. All the rules apply pretty much equally to all those entities, and they all have to file campaign finance reports. So the kind of target audience, which I know we have many people here today from, include treasurers for political campaigns, candidates for political office, people who are acting as campaign managers, and even just journalists and concerned citizens. Because when you know the campaign finance laws, it gives you an edge to look up opposition. You know, where are they getting their money from and where are they spending it on? It gives you a perspective if you are a citizen who wants to know who's funding whose campaigns. And if you're a campaign manager, it's just helpful to know what the rules are so that your campaign doesn't run afoul of them. A lot of people have treasurers that are treasurers for the first time. They can still make mistakes. The more eyes we have looking at the rules and double checking, triple checking to make sure we're not running afoul of them, the better. So most of the perspective of this presentation is going to put you in the shoes of a treasurer. Even if you're a candidate or a campaign manager or somebody else, you're going to benefit from knowing what the treasurer has to do, because the treasurer is the main acting entity with campaign finance reports. A little bit about me and why I'm qualified to talk about this. I've been a candidate for office twice. I ran for Council District 6 here in Toledo in 2011. I also ran for Council at Large in 2013. I've been a treasurer for a handful for about 3 local campaigns, a gubernatorial campaign. I've also run an issue campaign here with Toledoans for Safe Water, and I've also done the reports for a Lucas County Green Party. So I've done a political party as well. I've acted as campaign manager on 3 different campaigns, and I've also been party chair for a number of years. So I've really seen it from a lot of different angles. It's the whole reason I'm enumerating this. It's not just to toot my own horn. But through those years, I've not only looked at and filed a number of campaign reports, but I've looked up reports from all sorts of other people, and I'll have some fun stories to share with you about that a little later on. But like any good presentation, I think we should start with just what is campaign finance? Okay, what is this term we keep throwing around? It's basically the laws governing the raising and spending of money for political purposes. If you're trying to influence an election, if you're trying to influence an election either for or against a candidate or for or against an issue, chances are money is going to be involved. And if money is involved, you've got to have a political action committee or a campaign committee. You've got to have this entity that registers with the Board of Elections or the Secretary of State and lets them know where you're getting your money from and what you're spending it on. So again, that applies across the spectrum. And some of the main entities that are involved with this include the Ohio Secretary of State. And if you're running for a statewide office, like something in the Ohio General Assembly, or you're running for governor or state treasurer or something like that, that's who you're going to be filing your reports with. If you're running for local office, your county offices, your municipal offices, your local school board, all that's going to be handled by the Board of Elections. So basically, you got down in Columbus the Secretary of State, and then all of its satellites in the county boards of election. And they kind of share the load that way. And then every campaign has to have a treasurer. That's a real live human being. It's not a non-profit, not an entity. You can't farm it off to a company. It's got to be a real live human being with a name and an address that the Board of Elections can go knocking on the door of when they have a question about where the reports are at and what's going on. And it's a little bit of a responsibility. At the bottom of every single campaign finance form is this declaration. This statement is made under penalty of election falsification. Whoever commits election falsification is guilty of a felony of the 5th degree. It's pretty serious language. They're basically saying that if you deliberately falsify election records, you could be held liable and convicted of a felony. So, be careful. That's the gravity of what you're dealing with when you file those reports. But every campaign needs a treasurer. A lot of times, if you step up to run for office, especially if you're coming from the outside or you're a real grassroots person, well, you got to find your own treasurer or act as your own treasurer. That's a scary thing to do when you see that felony hanging above your head. But the two big entities that you can always go to consult for information are the Secretary of State and the Board of Elections. You should always go to the Board of Elections first with any questions you have. So I'm not going to be giving out my cell phone, although I will be reachable and generally try to be a nice guy, but I get pretty busy. If you have questions that I don't address here and that you forget to ask me, you can always call the Board of Elections. They're open 8 to 4:30, and there's a campaign finance option, and you'll be put in touch with a full-time employee who is trained in this and can answer your question. They don't ask for your name, so if it's something that you're worried they're going to come back and throw you in jail for, you generally don't have to worry about that. And their whole job is to help you be successful, kind of like what I'm trying to do with you here today. But what I'm trying to do is give you guys a leg up so that you probably won't need to call the boards of election. Now, the Secretary of State has published a document called the Ohio Campaign Finance Handbook. This is like the Bible of everything we're covering today. This is what you're going to reference if there's some really nuanced, weird thing that's kind of an odd duck. Your first stop is going to be to go to this book. You can get physical copies of it down at the Board of Elections, which is 3rd floor of One Government Center here in Toledo. Or you can go online and view the whole thing there. There's a link that'll open it up and you can check it out. But that's got all the detail. So you should always check that stop first, and that's a good thing if it's after 4:30 and nobody's in the Board of Elections office and you got a question. But between those two resources, being able to call the boards of election and being able to check the Campaign Finance Handbook, you can probably figure out what you need to do. That being said, the Campaign Finance Handbook is pretty thick. It covers a lot of scenarios that probably 90% of them will never apply to you because they're covering everything under the sun. They're trying to cover the judicial races and Levin accounts and all these other weird things that are really deep inside politics stuff that probably only a handful of people in the state actually have to know or deal with. For the lay person who's just running for office or trying to help somebody run for office, 90% of that book is just stuff you have to sift through to get to what you care about.
Do they have cliff notes?
That's essentially what this presentation is.
Oh.
So, that being said, these are the main people. Your Treasurer, Board of Elections, Secretary of State. These are the three things we're always going to keep going back to. So, when you get started, let's assume that you are a candidate who's running for office for the first time. Or you've been asked by a candidate to serve as their treasurer because you love this person and you're willing to sacrifice a lot of free time and your patience and understanding, you're going to get involved. So, the very first thing you have to do is file this form called the Designation of Treasurer form. Like all the forms I'm going to talk about today, there's actually a nice bureaucratic number associated with it. That number is Form 30-D. Okay? Can you just feel the bureaucracy flowing from that? Form 30-D. Okay? It's also known as a Designation of Treasurer form. You can find it by searching on Google or whatever your preferred search engine is, Ohio Designation of Treasurer form. There's a link to it right here, the PowerPoint, for those of you who get a copy of this afterward. It doesn't cost you any money to file this at all. Anybody can go out today, fill out this form, and turn it back in. And as you can see from it, it's a little intimidating just because there's so many check boxes and fields, but all it really wants to know is what kind of campaign are you working on? Is it for a political party account? Is it to help somebody get elected to a legislative office? Is it to influence an issue, that sort of thing? And then what's the name and address of the campaign, and what's the name and address of the treasurer? It's pretty straightforward stuff. It's just all boxed into a bunch of fields, some of which you don't need to fill out, some of which you do. You can always call the Board of Elections for clarity on what you need to fill out and what you don't. But you can get a copy of it for free. They have, if you go to the Board of Elections, again, 3rd floor, One Government Center, they'll have one there for you. And usually if you go there and say, I want to run for office, they're going to give you a copy of this along with the handbook. So this is what you have to do legally before you raise any money. And people get in trouble for that. A candidate I can recall, Douglas DeCamp, in 2011, was also running for Council District 6, so he's a competitor of mine. And he got dinged because he started putting up yard signs. And the Board of Elections said, wait a minute, you haven't filed a designation of treasurer form yet. And you clearly have raised and spent money because you've got money for yard signs. So he was found in violation of campaign finance law, which is not a good way to get your name out there. That's not the kind of press you want to get. So make sure before you do anything on a campaign, this form gets filed first. Okay? And it doesn't expire. Once it's filed with them, you can take forever. or you could start that day going out and raising money. But turn this in, just hand it over to them physically at the Board of Elections, and they're going to give you a slip of paper that confirms that they got it, and you're ready to roll.
It can be filed online too.
I think for statewide offices, locally, I think the Secretary of State does not like people filing electronically for local stuff. So if you're running for state or even a federal office, they're a lot more flexible, but for some reason locally they don't like electronic filing. They want you to do physical, turn it into us. It'd be nice if you could just send this stuff via email, because most of it comes to you as a PDF, and you could fill it out on your computer, but at least as of today, you still have to print out physically and give them a physical copy that they turn around and scan over at the Board of Elections.
I think one of the reasons, too, is that they want to give a receipt to show that you have filed.
Right. So part of that is to get like a physical piece of paper in case there's a dispute. So one thing here, and this is just a slight divulgence, this is really not campaign finance related, but it's finance related, and it's related to campaigns. For those of you that are getting started and want to know this, the order I recommend is after you do the designation of treasurer form, you get something called an EIN. The EIN is a tax reference that makes the IRS happy about what you're doing. You can get it for free online anytime at irs.gov. If you look up EIN registration, IRS, that'll come up. You fill out a bunch of stuff and they spew a PDF at you and says, here's your ID number. An EIN is basically a social security number for the campaign that you're creating. It kind of births it into existence within the tax system. And it's kind of funny because for the level of fundraising that goes on for local races, that's the last time you'll ever really need to work with the IRS. Okay, you don't actually have to worry about filing any kind of taxes or doing any of that stuff or worrying about how it'll affect your personal stuff. It doesn't come into play really. Okay. But you get the EIN. With the EIN, you can go to a bank or a credit union and you can open up a bank account, which you don't have to have, but most campaigns are going to want to have, especially because having that campaign account makes it really easy to hook up to a PayPal account, which is how a lot of people like to do online fundraising anymore. So all these are just practical things related to money in a campaign. It's got nothing to do with campaign finance reports. But just so people know the sequence that you generally go through, it's designation of treasurer, EIN, bank account, PayPal, or whatever other crowdsourcing you want to do, and you want to walk away from it at that point. Yes?
Can I make a comment? You can go to the irs.gov and do that, but sometimes it's a little bit complicated. Whether it's a tin or pack or the different categories, what to fill out. I've had best success by going to the bank and having a bank officer that specializes in this do it, and they can get the appropriate EIN number for you doing it.
It's good to know. So that's a
I found it
resource.
really confusing too to know what to check and how to get to the appropriate category for an EIN for my campaign. It went up 3 different times and I was like,
Right.
But I did finally do the right one.
They do have options that specifically say this is for a political campaign, but you got to get to the right options because they don't make it so explicit up front. You got to find well, it's kind of a nonprofit, but kind of not. It's not like incorporated. It's not a tax deduction thing. It's in a weird space with the IRS. It's technically considered a 527 group if you want to look that up, but it gets complicated. But you're right. If you want to get that EIN, I guess you can go to the bank and check the teller, and they might have some resources.
Specifically ask for an officer that specializes in it. A lot of them don't know the specialty of how to do that either.
Right. So yeah. And I'll say this too. When I've gone to open up bank accounts, not every bank or credit union is comfortable opening bank accounts for campaign accounts. A lot of them look at you like, "What is this exactly? So where's your articles of incorporation?" Well, we're not a nonprofit. Well, then what are you? You're not a personal account because you have a name for this group. So how do we know you're a legal entity? So you have to find banks or credit unions that understand that and will work with you. Typically, it gets kind of like their nonprofit business type account, but they work a few things and just hook it up so your campaign is essentially seen as a nonprofit in the eyes of the corporate structure of the bank. So that's all just practical stuff. Doesn't really deal directly with campaign finance law, but it's helpful things to know for those of you working on campaigns.
They also said you should not open it up at where you do your personal banking, that it needed to be a separate institution altogether.
You're running for a federal office too, so I know.
State.
You're running for state office, okay. Yeah, there may be some different rules there.
Several, like, separate.
I mean, generally, it's good for ethical reasons probably to have that. But, well, after you've opened up and you exist in the eyes of the Board of Elections, they're going to give you a reporting calendar, which you can find by going online. You can just search for Ohio Campaign Finance Calendar. It's a list every year of these are when the deadlines are for the reports you need to file. So from the moment that you start fundraising, they expect you to get on this calendar of turning in reports. You can get these from both the Secretary of State and the Board of Election. And as soon as you have filed with them, they're going to send you a letter in the mail. I actually have one over here that I just got recently. So you'll get a nice letter in the mail that says, hey, just so you know, there's an upcoming deadline that you might need to file for. So this will apply primarily to primary, general, and special elections. And the big question you have to ask yourself, if you're a candidate working on a campaign, is your campaign going to be on that ballot? If so, there's going to be two deadlines. You can choose which one you want to do. There's the pre-election or the post-election. Okay? They kind of give you some choice. You got to do one or the other, though. And the pre-election is, I think, usually like 12 days or about 3 weeks out before the election, and then the post-election is like a month after the election. It's why they do it. It's a little confusing, but bottom line is, if you're going to be on a primary or general election, or even a special election, you have to pay attention and do your post or pre. This is a big area where you will lean heavily on the boards of elections to be like, when is my next report due, given my context? And they can clear that up for you. If you're working on an issue campaign, like I'm the treasurer for a group called Toledoans for Safe Water. We opened our account in 2016 for a special election that ended up happening in February 2019. So for 3 years, we had primary and general elections came and went that we weren't on the ballot for. We could ignore the pre and post election filing deadlines. What we went by instead were what are called the annual and semi-annual deadlines. So if you're kind of maintaining an account between elections, like say you're elected to something that lasts 4 years, so you're not going to be on a ballot again for another 4 years when you run for re-election. For those remaining 3 years in between, you've got to file an annual and a semi-annual report, one in summer, one in winter, that updates the Board of Elections on how much money you've raised over a 6-month period. So it's kind of maintenance. They want to know where money's coming from. This is something that a lot of people use to see if candidates seem to be raising a lot of money in preparation for a re-election bid or something like that. But in general, every campaign has to at least file the annual and semi-annual. But if you're on an election as well, then you have to pay attention to the pre/post election deadlines for when you turn in your reports. Again, convoluted, but that's just what the laws are. So when I say, choose either the pre or post for each applicable election, by that I mean an election that you're actually going to be on the ballot for. If you are starting early, like let's say you're running for president next year, well, you don't need to worry about a pre or post election for this November election because you're not on the ballot for it. You're going to be on the ballot next year sometime. So you just do the annual and semi-annual and you go about your way. All right. I want to move on from that subject just because it's a little involved. So what's inside of a report? All right. Well, there's a bunch of standard forms. Again, we have like Form 30A, 31A, 31B, 31C. There's a bunch of forms that you use and fill out in some combination that make up the report. These are prescribed. You can get them off the website for the Secretary of State. We've got a link down there. Really, most people are going to use 3 or 4 of these, maybe 5 or 6. You don't use that many of them. The only one that's really absolutely required in every context is the cover sheet. And the cover sheet is kind of what it sounds like. It explains which report this is. This is a pre-primary for an election taking place on this day for this campaign. And it also has some summative information that includes, here's how much money was raised during the period, here's how much was spent, here's how much we have on hand. And at the bottom of that cover sheet, there has to be an actual signature from the treasurer where they sign and date as they turn it in. So it becomes like a legally binding, affirmation that what's in this report is accurate. And that goes back to the election falsification and how they try to hold people accountable. So the cover sheet here is going to be where most of your info is. But the two big ones you use a lot are the statement of contributions received. That's a form where you record all the information for the donations you've gotten. And the statement of expenditures, which is where you record all the stuff you bought. Those are the two ones that get used the most. But a lot of candidates will do self-financing, which we'll talk about. You may have a fundraising event, which gives you a couple forms. In-kind donations are a thing in campaign finance, which we'll cover in a little bit. So there's a few things that crop up often enough that you should probably know. But every report is just made up of some combination of these filled out, put together, stapled, turned into the Board of Elections. This is the raw material that you pull from. So, like I said, there's for donations and for expenditures, Form 31A and 31B. These are your bread and butter. Every donation that you receive to a campaign, you have to record this information. And there's fields for you to fill this out on those forms.
Even if it's $5.
Correct.
$1.
Correct. I'm going to put an asterisk on that, which I'll explain in a minute. But yes, every single donation. If somebody writes you a check for 23 cents and you cash it, well, you're going to file a little thing that says so-and-so who lives at this address gave me a check for this amount on this day. So those are like the 5 big pieces. The name of who gave the money, their address, how much they gave, the form it took, check, cash, PayPal, whatever, the date that you received it, and then if you're talking about a statewide, like General Assembly or governor or something, you do have to record the person's employer and job title if it's $100 or more. If you're doing local races, you never have to worry about getting that info from people. A lot of people find that invasive to some degree, but that's just a requirement. If you're running a statewide race and it's a $100 or more donation, it's got to get recorded. Now, there's a parallel thing here for expenditures. It's much the same information, just in reverse. Who did you give money to? What's their address? How much did you pay them? What form did the payment take? What date was the payment on? But there's this added field where you have to explain, how does this relate to the campaign? What was this for? Okay? So, because there's a little bit of obvious, you can't just say, I gave all this money to so-and-so because he's a cool guy. You have to actually explain, well, we gave him this money to do printing for us, or you bought t-shirts or bumper stickers or commercial time. You don't have to be super detailed. It's usually enough to say, bought commercials, bought stickers or something. If you want, you can say, I bought this many stickers at this size. But it's up to you to be how detailed you want to be.
Are you going to go over allowed expenditures?
That one is subjective enough that I can get that there's some broad guidelines for it. And it's broader than a lot of people think. As long as there's some use to the campaign, even if it's relatively minor. Like you can use campaign money to buy gifts for your, like, oh, I just wanted to get you a nice gift for all the hard work you've been doing volunteer-wise. Buying money for a pizza party. Throwing a celebratory party where you rent a hall and buy balloons. All that is actually covered. It gets controversial where it may be technically legal, but there can be ethical concerns, right? So a controversial one of my friends, Mike Ferner, ran for mayor in 1993. And if you know Mike Ferner, he did not have a lot of nice clothes. And he needed some because he was running for mayor. So he used some of his campaign finance money to buy some nice clothes that would be befitting of a mayor and that he could wear while he was going door to door so people didn't think he was a scrub. And that was actually legal. You're allowed to do that because that does happen. However, it was brought up in the campaign and people thought, well, look, he's using it as a slush fund for his own personal wardrobe. That kind of stuff comes up a lot. And it's kind of a subjective thing. Was it really because he just felt like getting new threads, or was it because the guy didn't have a lot of good clothes? It's up to you to decide. So some of it, again, may be legal, but it could raise questions about your campaign and its integrity if you're not careful. So they have, in the campaign finance handbook, they spend some time saying, well, it's got to be necessary, it's got to be all this, but it's very subjective stuff, and a lot of times it's kind of a judgment call. Anything that's clearly not directly related to the campaign can definitely be brought up, and you could possibly be found in violation.
Is anything that you are doing for your campaign, does it have to be run through that account?
Yes. If anything that comes out of your personal bank account to benefit the campaign is considered an in-kind donation. And that goes for anybody else. If you have a friend or a relative who buys the stamps that you use for a mailer, that's an in-kind donation. Any money that is used to benefit your campaign should go in this report, and especially if there's any communication with your campaign or any relationship or connection. Okay, so you have to record that. And it would actually be a violation of campaign finance law to not disclose that there was money spent on something. You are supposed to record everything you do because this is what it's about. It's about transparency. Okay? So another thing about the expenditures is they need to see proof. They don't need to see proof that somebody donated money to you, but they need to see proof of where you spent it. And for them, proof is two things. A copy of a canceled check from your bank that actually shows a check that was processed for this amount to this person, or an invoice marked paid in full from the person that you bought something from. Those are about the two things they will accept. And if you don't have that evidence, as far as they know, you may have committed fraud by just saying, oh yeah, I gave so-and-so $1,800 for stickers. How do they know that? They want to see a paper trail, okay? They need to see a canceled check, and you have to get a copy and print it and turn it into them with your report, or an invoice marked paid in full.
Isn't there a $25 limit on that for the expenditures?
I'm not sure of that rule. I haven't heard of that. That could be, but I can't say yes or no as far as like turning in the evidence of it.
Yeah.
I will say though that that's not publicized, whereas the rest of this information will get scanned and put online for other people to find, at least here in Lucas County. And where it's not online, people can request it and get access to it. They do not share the canceled checks and the invoices with the public. And the reason for that is canceled checks have your bank routing number and all that stuff. You know, they're trying to protect your privacy to some degree. But you do need to give it to the Board of Elections for them to actually review and make sure that you're not committing fraud.
Can monthly bank statements be adequate without actually having the canceled check there?
That's going to be a judgment call by the Board of Elections. If you're in a pickle and you're like, look, I'm not trying to defraud anybody, but I don't have this evidence, they will work with you and they may accept that, but it's going to be up to them. So you got to call them and say, here's the situation. I myself actually got started with campaign finance reports by jumping in to save a campaign I was supporting. Their treasurer was actually a CPA who just decided, I don't feel like doing this anymore, and disappeared off the face of the earth and stopped returning phone calls. So they said, we really need a campaign finance person. I know you've never done it before, but you seem like a smart guy, and we trust you. So they threw me into that role, and I had to clean up a lot of messes, including money that we didn't have canceled checks or an invoice for. And the Board of Elections dinged me and said, you can't do that. We'll talk a little bit later about what happens when you make mistakes, but basically they said, if you can go back to those people and get an invoice marked paid in full, which is what I did. I went back to them, we had a good relationship, and they said, oh yeah, we can do that. Or print me up an invoice and I'll sign it and confirm. So we had to get some documentation from the people we purchased stuff from affirming it that we didn't have before. We had to go back. That's a pain. You want to avoid doing that. And of course, if people really want to be slimy against you, they can say, look, this guy doesn't know how to file campaign finance reports. Do we trust them to run our government? So again, you want to be careful with some of this stuff and be as vigilant as possible. So a hand back there, and speak up too, because we are recording this and we want to get voices.
Sean, I use bank statements all the time because we use the debit card.
Gotcha.
And they were accepted. In fact, I had asked and it was allowed. Now, if I had a check, I sent a copy of the check, but I used the bank statement every time we paid for something with a debit card, and they accepted it.
So yeah, at least in some cases, I guess that'll work. So thank you for sharing that and getting that on record. And you worked on, just for clarity and for the purpose of documentation, you worked on the Keep the Jail Downtown issue campaign.
Correct.
And sometimes there are like a few funky rules between issue and I don't think that would be one of them, but just so people know, there are certain rules that apply to candidates but not issue campaigns and vice versa. So there's not a ton of them. Most everything is universal, but those two sometimes have differences.
If you are paying a campaign manager, do they have to give you then an invoice for services rendered?
It's probably best practice and a good thing to do if you can work that out. You can get a generic invoice template and kind of do one in-house where you go to Word and get an invoice template, draft it up, fill out the fields like you would if you were running a small shop or an independent contract kind of operation, and generate those invoices for, but you gotta mark it, it has to say the words paid in full. It's the big thing I was told when I had to do that stuff. They don't want to just see an invoice, they need to see the invoice marked paid, and not partially paid, but paid in full. So.
Just out of curiosity, for big campaigns, if you hire people, if they're on salary, how do you have to interact with paying Social Security for them, and health benefits or medical or anything like that?
I'm going to do my favorite thing in the academic world and say that is beyond the scope of this class. But it's a very good and practical question. I will say on bigger campaigns, I mean, where people are actually getting paid like a salary akin to what they would get in the workforce or in the private sector, yeah, I mean, there are some tax considerations, and you should seek an actual CPA or somebody who can help you with that. For smaller campaigns where effectively people are, for one reason or other, independent contractors, it's actually more on them to file appropriately. You should file like a 1099 with them just so that they have the record. But they're probably, legally, they're going to be obligated to pay about a tax rate of about 35% on everything they bring in because they're effectively independent contractors for you.
So you have to do it 1099?
It would be best practice. However, honestly, they're probably not going to notice that for campaigns where it's $1,000 for this guy and $500 for this guy. What they're really concerned about is somebody making much more substantive amounts. Where that line is, I am not a lawyer and I'm not a tax preparer, but I would consult with your CPAs about that. It's kind of an arcane field of campaign work, is to know where the tax liabilities could reside. But I will say that if your campaign is generally in the neighborhood of no more than 30, 40, 50,000, a lot of that the IRS is not so much interested in. It's above about the $50,000 per year mark, they start to get interested in knowing what you filed and where the money went. But they generally have exceptions, and if you Google IRS 527 organization, they'll have some guidelines where they, and if you dig deep enough, they'll explain, you don't really need to worry about filing taxes if your campaign raised less than 50 grand or some other amount. It's only when you start getting to the presidential levels and you're doing big money moving that they get interested naturally. So a lot of your stuff with donations and expenditures are going to be between these two forms, and these are the bread and butter. Make sure that every donation you've got these. If you're missing any of this information, you've committed campaign finance violation. If you don't want to include somebody's address because they're a diehard libertarian and believe in privacy and they just don't want to share it, well, you got to make a decision about whether or not you're going to accept that donation or not, because it's technically a violation.
If you're at a fundraiser, I mean, I've contributed and nobody's asked me to fill all of that out.
Do you remember the asterisk I told you about earlier? It's coming up. So that very thing will be addressed in just a moment. One more question in the back and we're going to go for it.
I've been doing some research on the reporting forms.
Mm-hmm.
I found forms that had numerous empty fields. And I'm not sure if it was an amended report or like a pre or post or whatever, but how could you get out of that? Could you file another amended report to try to cover yourself?
We'll cover what happens when people make mistakes later on and address that very point. But there is a slide for that. Okay? So, here's the basic rules, or at least a handful that I've run into. Some of the ones here are kind of obscure, like you got to be at least 7 years old to donate. I have no idea how that came, but that's in the law. Apparently, at the age of 8, you are cognizant enough to donate to a political campaign. I have no idea what the science was, but that is the law. Look it up. It's in the Campaign Finance Handbook. I'm not making that up. But some of the more practical ones, there's no anonymity. Okay, you're never allowed to just say, I got a $50 donation. It was cash in an envelope. I don't know who it was from. You're not really supposed to do that. You've got to record their name and address. Now, they do say that if you do receive an anonymous donation, you're supposed to put a best effort into seeking out who it was to get their information or to return it. But if you're like, oh, I just can't find it, or I don't have that money anymore, again, you call them and they'll work with you and try to address it. But you have to have a back and forth with the Board of Elections or the Secretary of State at that stage. Another kind of side effect of this, you can't have petty cash. That was something I ran into in a campaign that I took over for. The CPA was used to certain accounting rules that said, oh yeah, you can have like petty cash or miscellaneous expenses. That does not exist in the campaign finance world. You can't just say, well, there was $20 and we gave it to so-and-so so he can get gas or maybe a pop or something. We don't know, we just gave it to him. Can't do that. No petty cash. You've got to record every cent that you spend because they care. That's what this is about. transparency and accountability, and trying to rein in some of the ways that money moves around in politics. So you can't do petty cash, and every expenditure, no matter how small, you got to record. Another interesting thing is that no one person can donate more than $100 in cash per election cycle to a campaign or an issue. So when I ran for office, I had a fundraiser, and a friend of mine came with $500 in cash to contribute. And I had to do the tough job of saying, thank you so much for your contribution. I can keep 100 of this. Would you be so kind as to write a check for the remaining 400? And that's a humble thing to have to do, but she said, okay, sure. And of course, she was a little perturbed, just like, well, what's the problem? I'm giving you money. But that's the campaign finance law. And so she did write the check for the remainder, but you're not allowed, if somebody gives you 20 in cash this time, and then a couple months later they do 70 in cash, and a couple months later they do 50 in cash, well, now you're over $100 cash for that cycle, and the Board of Elections may well come back and say, if they find it, they're going to come back and say that's a violation. You got to return that cash back to them.
What's the cycle?
The cycle is generally like calendar year, generally.
A year.
I'd say calendar year is a good rule of thumb, but check with your Board of Elections to be absolutely sure. Raffles and games and chance are not exactly illegal, but they may as well be. I had to probe this when I work in IT, and I had a friend who ran a computer store. He said, I have this wonderful new laptop. If you want to do an auction for it and keep the money for a campaign, that'd be great. I said, that would be nice, except I looked into it and called the Board of Elections, like, can't do it. No raffles or games of chance unless the prize is something that is not of great material value, and the example they give is a bouquet of flowers. So you make sense of that. Basically, they just say they don't want anybody, the litmus that makes a little more sense is if anybody would reasonably buy this because they want the laptop more than they care about your campaign, because they're angling for it, or whatever the prize is, it's not going to fly. The primary purpose of the money being moved has to undisputably be, I support this candidate. So if it's a raffle and you get something silly or non-material, okay. But if it's for a laptop or a brand new Porsche or something, I don't know what kind of connections people in the room have here, but you can't do that. Now, of course, some people will say, well, what's to stop that guy from auctioning it off to his friends and then taking the money and giving it to the campaign? Well, and arguably, there isn't anything, and arguably that may not be a campaign finance violation, but it could be an ethical consideration, because some people could interpret it broadly to be money laundering. So those are the kind of things that you get into. So they highly discourage, and they'll tell you that in the campaign finance handbook, don't do games of chance or raffles to raise money.
No 50-50?
No 50-50.
Oh, okay.
Again, 7 years old, very important. Another thing is that corporations are not actually, like if you're a business or a nonprofit, you can't just donate directly to a candidate. That's forbidden. Now, if you want to donate to an issue campaign, that's another story. But if I want to support so-and-so, that's actually a campaign finance violation. Some of that slips through because people don't know that. But if I'm owner of Joe's, if I'm Rudy's or Nettie's or somebody locally, and I cut a check out of the Nettie's bank account, and it's from Nettie's, it's a campaign finance violation if it's to a candidate's campaign. You can't do it. Now, if Nettie's wants to support Keep the Jail Downtown or Lake Erie Bill of Rights or some kind of issue campaign or a levy, different story, but not candidates. And you cannot take contributions from foreign nationals. We had that situation arise where we had a very wealthy donor from London who wanted to cut a check for Mike Ferner. No can do. You got to be American national. Now you can have, if you're a green card holder. Yeah, well, that depends on how it gets moved, I guess. But green card holders are allowed to donate. Okay.
Out of curiosity, so what about the owner of the business if it's from a personal account?
Personal account, totally
So
fine.
okay.
Absolutely.
So it's just it can't come from the actual.
Not from the business account. Yeah. If the check says from Nettie's at the top, or whatever the business might be, I don't think the owners of Nettie's are doing.
No, yeah. I just
Arbitrarily.
didn't know if like owners are excluded as well, but if it's from
On a personal level, it's pretty much.
Is an LLC also considered a corporation?
Oh, yeah. What do you think that C stands for? Limited liability corporation.
And the maximum per individual is like 2,000?
So this handy dandy, well, this gives some of it. I don't know if, So as of February 25th, 2019, for the next couple of years, these are the campaign contribution limits. There's this chart, I know it's a little bit, it's probably a little bit hard to read from the back, but this is the table that they use to say if you're donating from one of these entities to one of these other entities, here's the actual limit on what you're supposed to be allowed to donate. So an individual can contribute up to about $13,292.35. Again, don't know why that exact amount, but that's the limit.
35 cents.
That's very important. And to a state party, a single individual can donate $39,000. Again, that's probably per cycle, which is usually a calendar year, maybe a 2-year span. It depends. And again, speak to the Board of Elections if you have questions. You can see some of them too are prohibited. Individuals can pretty much donate anywhere, but if you're running a county political party, like Lucas County Republicans or Democrats, there are certain prohibitions on, you can't cut a check to the Ohio Republican Party from the Lucas County. There's some prohibitions there. There's also caps. Where these caps come from, I don't know. It's a formula that they use and they generate and they pass laws on, but there are limits. Usually in local races, people don't surpass them. I think I've only seen one instance where somebody actually reached what was then the limit donating to a candidate. But yeah, for the most part, most people aren't donating in volumes that high, at least on the local level. Yes?
Now, a campaign can also contribute to another campaign, can it not?
Yes. You are allowed to donate to somebody else's.
And how is that recorded? And what are the limits?
It would be on this table something like let's say you're running for legislative office, that'd be a legislative campaign fund to, whatever the entity is. If it's another legislative campaign fund, well, at least on a statewide level, it looks like that's prohibited at this point.
But it would be something that you would show on your expenditures form.
Correct. It doesn't go onto a different special form. It's pretty much like any other expenditure, and then they would record it as just a regular
donation.
Yeah. So it doesn't get any real special treatment. Okay. And actually, quite a bit of money moves around locally from candidate to candidate. Yes. There's a lot of that. Marcy Captor will donate to a few people, or Teresa Feder will donate to a few people. If you follow, there's a lot of money moving around for different things.
So it gets, just to be clear, it gets recorded on that donations form.
Yeah.
Expenditures form.
Yeah. If you're cutting the check, you do it as an expenditure, and the campaign that receives it listed as a donation, like anything else. So, here's a few other scenarios. Nancy, we're getting to that point here. Fundraising event, this is the big one. So, you mentioned that you've been to fundraising events where nobody took your name and info. What they were relying on is this scenario. Because obviously, who writes these laws? Elected officials. So they will kick and scream if you get in the way of what's used to them. And that there's a practical utility to doing an event where people pass the hat or it's $5 at the door to get in. But if there's a fundraising event, you are allowed, as long as the donations were in cash and they were under $25 total per individual, you are allowed to not itemize that, meaning you don't have to record name, address. You just say there's a big pot of money and it was all from miscellaneous donations of $25 cash and under.
So that's something else that's different between campaign or between issues and candidates.
I think you can do that for both issues and candidates.
I got a certified on it.
We were doing that with our thing. We never got a problem with how we were
I
funding.
had to come up with names.
We did not. So there's maybe a discrepancy there that we'll need to look into. But I've done that for years on issue campaigns, and they've never, we never had to follow.
They didn't like me.
It could be. Hard to say. But you do this using forms 31E and 31F. That depends on whether if you hold a fundraising event, there are special forms for here's the money we brought in. And if there are donations over $25 or not in cash, you do have to record those individually like you would a regular donation. You just do it on this special form that's like it was for this fundraiser. But then if you spent money to put on that fundraising event, then that's also a special form that says we spent it on this and this and this for the streamers or the cake or whatever. So those two forms are used for fundraising events. Loans are commonly done. A lot of candidates will self-finance by granting themselves 0% interest loans. It's an interesting thing, but Steve Steele raised $10,000 for his campaign for at-large city council in 2009. So he took $10,000 of his personal money, put it into his campaign account, But instead of it being a regular donation, he recorded it as a loan that was 0% interest. And he's just one example. A lot of people will do this. And basically what he was doing was he was front-loading money in his campaign, so he had money to spend up front while he continued to fundraise from the public at large. And because it was a loan, he could, from his campaign account, legally pay the money back to himself that he fronted early on. So that's an option you have when you give money to your campaign as a loan. Or if you have a family member or a friend who will give money to your campaign as a loan. They could do it as a 0% interest loan, or if they want to, they can mark an interest rate, whatever. But most people do 0%. And with the loan, it means that if you raise the money, if the campaign account gets to a point where you have money down the road, you can pay that money back to the person who loaned it, usually the candidate themselves. Or if they decide, you know what, I'm not interested anymore in getting the money back, I'm pretty much going to treat it like a donation, you just forgive the loan. And then it just, okay, then the person doesn't get any more payment on that loan if they paid anything into it at all, and it effectively was a donation that they never, that they were possibly going to use as a loan but didn't. That's happened in a few scenarios as well. Some people,
Does that have to be stated on the form?
there's a special form. Does what exactly?
The forgiveness of the loan.
Yes, if you forgive the loan,
On a 31C, right?
Yes, there's a Form 31C that gets filed with the report, and if a loan is administered to a campaign, there has to be a 31C filed with it for the life of the loan to the campaign, until either it gets forgiven or paid off. That kind of updates where you're at with that loan. How much have you paid off on it, or has it been forgiven?
How often do you have to keep filing that if it's not paid off?
As often as your regular reporting deadline is. So annual and semi-annual during years when you're not running, or if you're going up for election, pre-general, post-general, pre-primary, it's the same schedule as always.
You update it every time you refile.
Right. Then in-kind donations, which I touched on a bit. Somebody can actually just go out and say, I don't feel like dipping in your campaign account, I'm going to buy the stamps, or I'm going to go buy this thing, and basically just give it to the campaign. Usually that's in the form of buying something that's used at a fundraising event, or buying something like I bought a bunch of yard sign wickets for your campaign, or I bought this thing, I bought pizza for your fundraising volunteer reward event. You should record that as an in-kind donation. And there's a special form for that, 31JI, and it's basically just who gave it, what was it, what's their address, what was the fair market value of what they gave.
In the case like yard signs, an in-kind donation would not require a disclaimer.
You mean on the yard sign itself?
Yeah.
That's an interesting philosophical, have you looked into that?
I think I have. I think
Okay. I can't vouch for that. That's interesting.
I've looked enough to believe it's true. I was looking for confirmation here.
What was
So
the
you
question
heard-
again?
So you know how yard signs have to have the disclaimer on the bottom? Let's say paid for by. He's saying, well, if it's donated yard sign printing, do you have to list that? I'm like, I don't know, because there actually are in campaign finance law, election communication where you list paid for by this campaign. They're pretty picky about that. So talk to the Board of Elections or the Secretary of State about that at your own risk, is what I would say.
The in-kind contribution, they have to be like with a credit card, or can it be cash?
It doesn't matter what form it took. I don't think they actually ask, because presumably they bought it somehow and just gave it to you. The thing they want to care about is what did they give to you? What was the material thing?
Yeah.
Was it? And you have to tell them what it is. It was like they bought pizza or they bought signs, and they were worth this much, and they gave it to me on this date, and here's their name, and here's their address.
Doesn't matter how much it's worth?
I don't think there's a cap. Probably shouldn't be enforced though. Again, if it gets weird enough, they're going to say, what's going on here? You might just have to talk to.
So what about, like you said, for the yard sign stuff, for stuff like that has been previously bought and used on separate campaigns that were lent to you by a different campaign?
All right.
So if they weren't personally bought, say the yard sign
Recycled.
things, they weren't bought for your campaign, but they've been bought for.
But these are
previous-
signs that have somebody's name on them.
No, they're not signs. They're just like
The wickets. You're talking about the
sure.
actual post.
Yeah, or this post for the large signs, something like that. Is that supposed to be filed?
To be thorough, I would do it. say I got, this many and they were worth probably this much. Those things, I think if you buy them new are like 69 cents
Okay.
from Clear.
So you should file it like that?
I would file it that way just to be on the safe side.
Okay.
But again, I think a lot of people do that and they don't necessarily file them, and it's kind of, does anybody notice or report it?
Yeah.
How clearly are people looking at trying to find problems with your campaign? And then how much would people care if they heard about that? That kind of stuff comes into play. And I think for certain things that are deep and not valued as more than like 25 bucks, I think they're not as concerned about that. If you do something that's in-kind donation for something and it's peanuts, they may be lenient. Again, talk to the Board of Elections, just to be clear. And then when you close your account, so you've run for office and maybe you didn't win, or you did win but now you're not running for re-election, you're closing your campaign account, you're done. What do you have to do? Well, you have to zero out the account, meaning you have to spend all the money that may be left in the campaign. Because you don't have to spend all your money. A lot of people get elected and still have $1,000, $10,000 left in their campaign account on the day they assume office. And usually they hold on to that money through the election period for their re-election campaign. So it's not uncommon for a lot of people who aren't actively running to maintain an account with the Board of Elections and in their bank account that has money in it. But if you're like, I don't feel like doing this anymore, you're going to close, you have to zero it out. So you have to give that money to another entity. Could be like, going back to the chart, maybe another campaign. But you could also donate it to a charitable organization. So any kind of 501c3, C4, that kind of thing. Debbie?
I was just wondering, does that donate all remaining funds to another campaign, from a campaign, or can it be from a political party to a campaign?
Probably from a political, that probably applies. I mean, if you're closing any account, whether it's a party, a PAC, candidate, if you close the account, you got to zero it.
Okay.
And again, if there's some there's some other circumstances, check with the Board of Elections. It's always going to be the answer. Just ask them and they'll tell you what you're allowed to do and not do.
Kind of the same question, I think, but could you donate it to either a political party or a PAC? I think that's what Debbie was asking. But
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's,
I mean, as long as it's otherwise legal for you to make that donation to the other political entity, you're allowed to do it. So give it to a candidate, give it to whatever, you have that. And Connor.
So, say you're running a race and you lose, but you don't want to close the account because you intend to run again. Is there a certain time period where you're restricted from taking in new contributions?
No.
You can take, say you don't want to run for several years, you can, for several years, just stack money up?
Yeah.
Okay.
You can
I
just
wasn't sure
keep
if there was-
raising money for like 10 years. They can't stop.
Okay.
You can scare everybody. You can hoard funds. They don't have any kind of limits as far as I know, and I haven't seen anything that would imply that there's a limit. I mean, it's all about raising money, so what you put in the campaign account is kind of up to you.
Can you go back to the fundraising part? So say we're having fundraiser, are we allowed to sell t-shirts, sell pins, sell stuff like that?
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of people will do hey, if you give a donation of $5, we'll give you a button or a t-shirt.
Okay. And like cookies or, you know what I mean, little stuff you're allowed to.
So what I would do is using these, if it costs money to make those shirts,
Okay.
We bought shirts and silk screen them, whatever your material costs were, you should try to buy them out of the campaign account.
Right.
And then you would list them as expenditures for the fundraiser. And then for the revenue, again, if those are $5, $20, and those are cash and they're under 25, you can lump it into miscellaneous contributions under $25 that are cash. It's just one item that's just a big pot, rather than every single person who bought a button. If you want to, you can still take everybody's name and address, and actually some campaigns like to do that because that's how they get contact info for people to reach out to. Sometimes the campaign finance laws where they ask for people's name and address can be used as a way to get people's contact info, but that's up to your campaign if you want to do that. You can also do in-kind donations there is another form that's not either of these, that's in-kind donations for a fundraising event. It's kind of like combining those two areas. There's a form for it. It's the bureaucracy hard work. All right. So here's, as just a practical thing, here's an example. This is Toledo's for Safe Water. This is a spreadsheet I've personally kept in a Google Drive. This is just an illustrative example of how one approach that you can take, and then I do recommend, especially if you're savvy with spreadsheets, the treasurer has to file a report with the Board of Elections. That's their main duty, okay? They don't actually have to be the ones who handle the money for the campaign. The one legal thing is they have to turn in and affirm the contents of the report. Now, I would recommend, and it's efficient, it makes economic sense, to have the treasurer also be the one who's collecting money at a fundraising event, putting money in the bank account, logging into PayPal and moving money into, it's nice to have one person handling all that if you can get it. Some campaigns will have, I have my friend doing the PayPal, I have another person doing this. It's fine as long as it all gets to the treasurer and the treasurer has the oversight to make sure that everything is accurate. But when all of that happens, something I've done is, all of this is the data that I would input into a donation received or expenditure form. The name of the person that either donated or got money, the type that it took, check, cash, PayPal, whatever, debit or credit, basically, did money go into the account or did it leave it? What date did it take place? What's the appropriate address for the donor or recipient? And then any notes, like what was this for? If you use those fields in a spreadsheet, and you just go, you have a master key to everything that goes into a campaign finance report.
Can you send us all of that? The spreadsheet part?
Some people have. I know that I think Karen Poor would be treasurer for folks, and she would just print out a spreadsheet in lieu of the actual forms. I've never done that. You might have to talk to the Board of Elections first and say, is that adequate to just give you the spreadsheet if it has all the info? They might want certain things tweaked, but you can try. Again, work with your Board of Elections and see if they're okay with it, and that way you save yourself plugging it into the forms. I like to do things the long way and to the way that's as much as possible, so there's no way to come back and dispute things with me. So I've always taken this data and then plugged it into the forms and turned it in the form that they're expecting. But this is something that's worked really well for me. I kept my own record in a spreadsheet when I would act as treasurer, and then when it came time to file the reports, I would just sit down, plug it into the piece of paper, print it out, and turn it in. And we always had this as a backup.
I've done that also with the running balance, and this actually kind of mirrors the bank account, the stuff, and you can look at that, look at this, and then finally it goes on the forms.
Right, it's easier to reconcile if you're looking at a bank statement, like, okay, does this line up? Is there a line item in the bank statement that lines up here? And I do, you can't see the bottom, but I do also, I sum everything in the credit field and subtract everything from the debit field to get what should be the on-hand balance. And I can easily adjust that to be like, well, what if it was just between these two dates? So I can see if that lines up with what I'm going to put in the reports. So this is just an example of one way to do it. You can do it however you want. But I found this works for me, and if it is something that's helpful to how you do treasury stuff, great. So when mistakes are made, which inevitably happens. So what happens if you don't turn your report in by the deadline? Well, if you don't do it, Board of Elections, first off, they're going to reach out to you and say, where's your report? They will actually call the number on file for the treasurer and try to get answers from them. But they're going to be a little upset because they do go through the hassle of sending you these nice reminders, so they're going to be like, what's the problem? There's a calendar that you can see that lists the dates that they're due. We sent you a mail notice, why isn't this here on time? And they do reserve the right to fine you more than up to $100 a day for every day that you're late. I don't know that they take advantage of that very often, because I've definitely known of campaigns that filed things 3, 4, 5 days late, and as long as they talk to the Board of Elections Board, it was like, don't worry about it. But in theory, if they feel like they want to send a message or look a certain way, or if they want to pursue it, they can legally fine you up to $100 a day that you're late. Now, what happens if there's errors in a report that you turned in on time? Well, you're going to get a nice little thing in the mail back, usually certified, so they know that you got it, and they're going to say, well, we found some problems, and here's what they are. And it's usually things like, these didn't add up, these numbers didn't add up, so you did your math wrong, go do it again. Do it proper this time. That's a common one. They'll say things like, you didn't give the address or the destination, you didn't provide some of the information you needed to, or you left this field blank and we need to know what that was. That's another thing they'll have you round out, cross your T's, dot your I's. And it could also be things like, oh, you received money from a business that's not allowed per campaign finance law, please return the money to that business in order to be compliant. So they'll come and they'll tell you not only what the problem is, but usually they'll tell you how to rectify it. And if it's a really complex situation, they might just say something like, call us and talk to us. But bottom line is you have within 21 days, I think it is, of receipt of that to actually submit an amended report. Now that report can have another set of problems, and then you get another 21 days to go back and fix that. You can keep kicking the can down the road if you really want to, but you don't want to. The more amended reports, keep in mind, especially if it's a very competitive race, people might be looking going, what's wrong? Why can't you file accurate reports? It doesn't look good for somebody who's running to be in charge of pretty complex systems.
I just want to mention too, those reports are not very user-friendly in editing.
Probably not.
Sometimes they don't take a correction or things like that, and you have to leave them blank and hand fill it in, and it's...
You can do that. You're allowed to be
Yeah.
part typed and part, you can do whatever.
Yeah.
But if you don't resolve the errors or if you just ignore them, I've asked what happens, and they say we refer them to the Ohio Board of Ethics and the Board of Ethics decides they can conduct an investigation into your campaign, and then that's where presumably, if you're found to be in some gross violation, they could theoretically convict you of a 5th-degree felony for election falsification. Has that ever happened? I don't know. I asked, and nobody could recall a time when they had heard about that occurring locally. There's definitely been cases of fraud, but it didn't necessarily deal with campaign money. So it's kind of an untested thing. You wonder how much of that is just bluster to try to get people to be disciplined, and how much of that is, will people really be held accountable if they mess up on this? Hard to say. So here's a few case studies I want to go through. Just a few practical examples here locally of people making mistakes. Because what better way to learn? I once heard somebody say, a wise man learns from his mistakes, but a genius learns from the mistakes of others. So let's learn from the mistakes of some others who have come before us. So let's meet Jeremy Demigall. Okay? Jeremy Demigall ran for City Council District 2 in 2011. Okay? And he actually worked for the Board of Elections. He became the Deputy Director of the Lucas County Board of Elections in 2008, but was fired after being accused of miscounting votes in the Lucas County Commissioner's race last year. So he decided he was going to run for City Council District 2 and kind of fight the system. He was very concerned about wastefulness and accountability. So let's take a look at some of his campaign finance reports. What does that say? Anonymous. Not only that, but he misspelled anonymous. But anonymous check for $25. Anonymous cash for $50. Now, okay, that $75 was the guy, I don't know if that's evidence enough to convict the guy of being a mobster, but clearly it doesn't speak well of his character. If he used to work at the Board of Elections and won't abide by some of their basic principles, like no anonymous donations, you need to record your donors. So he violated campaign finance law. Let's meet Adam Martinez. Adam Martinez, some of you may remember, was a one-term member of at-large Toledo City Council. He served from 2009 through 2013. Very nice guy. He just beams friendliness. And I have met him. All these people are nice people. I've actually talked to Jeremy Demigall too. Don't get me wrong. They're wonderful, very friendly people. But he's a very nice guy. This is a little convoluted, but some of the things we see here, we see that there were some problems that arose in his campaign. So let's take a look down here first. This is from a campaign. He had a guy named Arturo Quintero, and he had to cross out Arturo's name and write Adam Martinez and take over as treasurer. So without speaking to him about this, I can surmise that he had a treasurer who disappeared on him, which happens to people. And he is the candidate, couldn't find anybody, and he had to step in and become his own treasurer. Never a good situation to run into, but it does happen. And we see things like, these are a statement of contributions, so these are the money he's received. He just says miscellaneous deposits researching, $1,550. He doesn't know where the money came from. That's a pretty big violation of campaign finance law. I don't know where $1,550 of my money came from.
There's a big difference between $75 and that.
It goes up. And so he does some amended reports, and what do you know? He figured it out. Oh, all that money was just miscellaneous cash under $25. So he doesn't have to disclose anybody's name or anything. And it actually wasn't $1,550, it was $1,345, and that was okay. And they said, oh, everything's fine, and it's good. So that's a practical thing that actually happened here in Lucas County. You had a sitting city council member who had to take over as his own treasurer and had to take over and figure out where $1,500 of his money came from. Happens. A few other examples. I think I mentioned earlier Doug DeCamp, who's running for Council District 6, but was putting up yard signs before he filed a designation of treasurer report. And I'll put my clarification again. I've talked to him. He's a very nice guy. I know I technically ran against him and he against me, but very wonderful, friendliest guy. Didn't follow the rules. And that certainly probably hurt him in the public's eye, because that was some of the first press anybody heard about him, was that here's this guy running for office and he violated campaign finance law. Mike Bell, actually, that's more on me, to be honest with you. After I kind of got thrown in the deep end and was treasurer for that race I mentioned earlier, I had a little bit of free time, which is always dangerous. And I sat around for hours and I would pore over every single candidate's campaign finance reports, and I would make spreadsheets based on how much money they got from what sectors, how many were union donations, how many were individual donations, how many were individual over 100, how many were from PACs, what kind of PACs were they, what was the registration number, how much money did they raise total. I'm a facts and data guy. So it was really fun, and I have all that data, and that'll get published in some future thing when I have time. But part of when you're going through those things, I had to check to make sure what I was recording was accurate, which meant I had to go through and count everything and make sure it lined up with what was in the report. And in the middle of Mike Bell, which, does anybody know how much it costs typically, how much a candidate for mayor typically raises in Toledo? It's about $300,000. It's a lot of donations. It was a stack this thick when printed out of forms to go through pages after pages. And I actually found, I couldn't get my numbers to add up. I'm trying to figure out where I screwed up. And I stumbled into the middle of one of his reports. They had printed the same contributions page twice, but counted all the donations twice. And so I was like, oh, that was an error. You know, there were about 6 or 7 donations. A single page got printed twice, but counted as though they were separate, and therefore all of his numbers were off. And so I was like, I don't know what to do. So I called the Board of Elections and said, I think I found an error. And he said, okay, you know, what did you find? I explained it and said, okay, thanks. I called again a couple days later. I said, so did you guys look into it? Like, yeah, you're right. We missed that. We didn't notice that was a reprint of another page. Thanks for finding that, random stranger. And so what happens next? He said, well, we've notified his treasurer that he has to file an amended report accounting for the year. I was like, oh, I was thinking about that report and how thick it was. I'm like, oh, God, that sucks. So, I mean, that was clerical, I mean, obviously. But, you know, you wonder if that was accurate to what he was saying in his bank statements. You know, there was obviously some things that weren't being recorded, and there was got to be a mismatch. Maybe I helped find it for him. Little things like that can be found, and I guess it's just more illustrative of the fact that when you do this work, you can actually find things that the Board of Elections miss, because, hey, they're human too. And actually, an interesting thing from this year, and it's not really illegal, but it's an interesting thing that I think comes out to the public mind about who can donate to campaigns and what. I worked on an initiative called the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. Our group is called Fields for Safe Water. We did an issue campaign. We raised $4,000 or $5,000 for our cause. We had a group called the Toledo Jobs and Growth Coalition Forum that sprung up overnight. None of us could find out who they were. They ran attack ads claiming that we were all out-of-town extremists and not a soul from Toledo was behind this. And that really hurt as a grassroots campaign. But the beauty of it was when they opted to do the post-special election report, so we had to wait till a month after the election to see any of their data in the campaign finance reports. And it turns out the Toledo Jobs and Growth Coalition, well, they're not from Toledo, they're from Texas. And it's not a coalition, it's one entity. It was BP North America, and they donated $302,000 to the issue campaign. So, you know, part of me was upset that, you know, oh man, but part of me was like, man, I hope whoever got paid to run that campaign got fired, because when you put $302,000 into a race and lose to a $4,000 campaign, that's, I don't know. So I get to relish in that a little bit. But it was interesting because notice that you can call yourself whatever when you make an issue PAC. I mean, you could say, oh, well, yeah, we're the Toledo. There wasn't anybody from Toledo. That was brokered for them from a political consulting company out of Columbus. Their treasurer lived out in like Cleveland, and all the money came from Texas. Of course, what was the attack? Oh, these people are not from Toledo. That's sorry. The irony is so thick. But point being, you can name your committee whatever, and it was unlimited donations, and it was from a business. It was directly from BP. It wasn't BP's PAC. It was from the business account, $302,000. So that's an illustration of the fact that when you do issue campaigns, it's unlimited. There was no cap. That $302,000 is well above everything you saw on that list, and they, yeah, a lot of the stuff goes out the window, and a lot of that's your Citizens United Supreme Court decision from 2009, saying that they have this is the same thing as free speech for them to be able to donate as much as they want to fight issues. So one thing I thought about doing here, but in the interest of time, will I do this or not? I think I'll skip this. I was actually going to do live in front of you a campaign finance report. How exciting would that be?
Do it.
Do it.
I'm in no hurry.
I did no hurry. It would take about 5 to 10 minutes. It's actually not very long. Since the last report that we filed for Toledoans for Safe Water, which was the pre-election, pre-special, or no, we actually did a post-special election. We've only had 3 donations. So that's very easy. That's 3 things because the election's over. But people still kept donating to us after we won. It's like, I'm not going to say no, but so we've got money to put in to report for the semi-annual. So today's July 1st. The semi-annual report covers everything from January 1st through June 30th. And it's due at the last business day of July. So you have the whole month of July to cover everything from the first 6 months of the year, and that's your semi-annual report. As long as we have a campaign account open, we're obligated to file that report. Now, if we keep the campaign account open, we would have to file it again at the last business day of January 2020 to cover everything from July 1st through December 31st of this year. And that's the annual report. It's kind of misleading because it's actually more or less the second half, and it's everything since the semi-annual. But that's the 2 reports that you generally file. And I have the spreadsheet. I can pull it up, but it would take me like 2 minutes. You guys would be watching me fumble around. And I would just be plugging in information from that spreadsheet into the forms, filling out a cover sheet, and that's pretty much it. I'd have probably only 1 statement of expenditures. And those expenditures for me would be the fee that PayPal took for the donations that we got, because they were all through PayPal. The donations received would be the 3 and their names and addresses. And then the cover sheet saying, here's how much we had from the last report, here's how much we got since then, here's how much we spent since then, here's how much we have on hand, this is my name and date as treasurer, and by the way, this is Toledoans for Safe Water at this address, and this is the semi-annual filing report for 2019. That's the entire contents that I would fill in on the cover sheet. All of that is stuff that we've talked about today. It's nothing brain busting. It's just looking at the form and seeing what to fill out. Probably the most confusing thing for a lot of people when filling out the forms is the fact that there are fields that you leave blank, because they've shoehorned judicial races, legislative races, county races, city races, state races, all that stuff into one form. So there are boxes that you leave blank depending on what your use case is, but it really is just looking at them. Now, I'm going to skip the practice and go right to some of the funner stuff, what I think is fun, and just say, how do we look up reports? Okay, so we're going to go online for this. And let's look at a couple of Lucas County Boards of Elections. If you just search for that online, it'll pull up the Board of Elections website. And over here, you've got the campaign finance field. They'll give you some good resources here. They're going to link you to the forms that you need right there on the Board of Elections website, so you can go there and download them right off the internet. Some other miscellaneous petitions. If you want to see that list of the limits, that chart, that table, they have a link to it right there. This is the fun part for me, the campaign finance reports themselves. So the Lucas County Board of Elections holds everybody's campaign finance reports that were filed for 6 years. And they put them in what they call the document center. So at this point, going back to 2013, so there's probably stuff from when I ran, they do it a little flimsy, because some of these are, Cecilia Adams, who was a school board member at the time. If you want to see her annual report, you can click on that. The PDF of everything she filled out will appear. African American Leadership Caucus, David Ball, Jenny Barlow, it goes on, and they're generally alphabetized. So if you want to look up something, you got to kind of flip through here until you find what you're looking for. Sometimes candidates are listed by their last name, comma, first name. But if their campaign name is something like, I think mine was called Nestor for Toledo, or we have one like Friends and Neighbors of David Ball. If you have like kind of a fancier name, it might be alphabetized that way. So you have to kind of hunt around in here to try to find what you're looking for. And if you ever get bored, I do recommend you just poke around and think of a politician locally that you're interested in where their money comes from and pull up their report. Check it out. Now, to do something a little more practical, let's look at 2019. Keep the jail downtown so we can see Mary's fine handiwork here. We want to. But yeah, let's look at that Toledo Jobs and Growth Coalition. We can see it's early in the year, so we haven't gotten a lot of reports yet. There's only 2 pages worth of it here. But yeah, that Toledo, there's Toledoans for Safe Water, so this is my work. This was the post special. And you can see what goes into a form I would have filled out. What's the name of the committee? Toledoans for Safe Water. What's the address of it? Boom, boom, boom. What's the treasurer's name? Sean Nestor. What's the date of the election? It was February 26th. What kind of report is this? Annual, semi-annual, pre-primary, post-primary, pre-general, post-general? As bureaucratic as those forms are, they did not have a pre or post special, so I had to just box one in, and they said that's fine. Okay, so that's a good, weird 1 in a million situation. And this is in 2019. Statewide candidates only. We're not a statewide candidate. We leave that part alone. This is not an amended report. This is an inaugural report that nobody's found a problem with, which they didn't. Thank you very much. Guess who did have to file an amended report? Toledo Jobs for Growth Coalition. Okay. And for as much money as they spent, I'm just saying. Anyways, from the last report that was filed before this post special, the balance on hand was $3,152. We got $4,609. So, and we didn't get, other income is usually like a catch-all for like the, candidate self-loan. I loaned myself 0%, $10,000, 0% interest, that would have gone here, but we didn't have anything like that. Monetary funds available was the sum of those two. This is how much money we spent since the previous, which is $5,899, which left us $1,862 remaining. Didn't really do any in-kind stuff, didn't have any outstanding loans or debts, so all that remained blank. Sign, date, and there are 11 pages worth of contributions, because this was right before an election. So if we start scrolling, we'll see here's the first contributions page. You do have to number them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You do that yourself just to make it easier on the folks reading. We can see things, see, they didn't dig me, Mary. Miscellaneous contributions received at fundraising events. Raised $56 in cash. And on top of recording this in a regular donations form, I had to file that other special form that was just for outlining. I had to basically repeat this information on a form that was, yes, there was a fundraising event on this day, and this is how much we got. Then we start seeing people's names. Notice the employer and occupation is left blank. It's a local race. It's not a statewide race, and this wasn't a donation of 100 or more. A check for $40, date. One other little kernel of truth I'll throw at you is that a lot of people send checks by the mail, right? And the checks will be dated from probably the day they wrote it. But by the time you receive it, it's a week later. Which date do you record?
When you receive.
When you receive it. Glad to hear so many people know that already. So you actually ignore the date on the check. You just say, I got it on this day. You're supposed to record everything you get on the day you receive it. And that can be a little bit, you wouldn't expect that based on the fact that the checks will have a certain date on them. But if you go through this, you can see all the money that we raised. At the bottom of each of the contribution pages, you have to sum everything from that one page alone. So,
how many fit on one page?
I think 7 right now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, 5 donations per page. So it's a lot of plugging in, a lot of pages. And then for that cover sheet that we saw up top, I had to take the page total from each page, add it together, and line it up. Again, a lot of your amended reports will be based on, wait a minute, we added stuff up and it didn't match what was on the cover sheet, so go back and do your math right. Arithmetic's a good skill to have. So all of this was turned in, and this is a good example of an actual real live campaign finance report. So let me go back here. If you're running for a state office, it's a different search engine. than what you see for Lucas County, the local stuff. There's this guy here, and you search by the campaign name, and it's actually nicer because they can put it in data that you can actually export to like an Excel file, so you can do a lot more data stuff with it. But I just want to take a few minutes to talk about what is it that we should be looking for. Okay, so let's say maybe you're doing opposition research because you're running for a competitive seat and you want to know what's going on with your opponent. Or maybe you're a citizen who just wants to know who's kind of behind what candidates and who's really driving the campaign. The usual stuff is to look for campaign finance violations, like they didn't list data and apparently the Board of Elections didn't slap them down hard enough or somehow missed it. Totals don't add up. Questionable expenditures. Okay, like I mentioned earlier, that example with Mike Ferner, when he purchased clothes for his campaign, that was considered questionable. It was considered legal. I think that was a competitive race with Cardi Finkbeiner in 1993, so I think they tried to make that an issue, and the Board of Ethics came back and said, well, he's allowed to do it, but it certainly put him through the ringer in the press, and in a competitive race, it kind of put a little stink on him. So you want to try to avoid that by avoiding those ethical considerations. Yeah.
I missed that earlier. You bought what, t-shirts or like actually clothes?
Dress clothes. He didn't have like nice like blazers and stuff. He's always been like a Hawaiian shirt, so like khaki pants kind of guy.
And an army jacket.
Yeah. So when you run for
Sherry?
Mike Ferner.
Ferner.
Yeah.
So you can do that?
That makes more sense.
You can technically yes, but again, the Board of Ethics in that case found it was a legitimate expenditure because he was using it to like look good when he was going door to door. But of course, to the public, it's like, well, I don't know, is that guy going to go with a slush fund with public money? You know, so you have to think about that. But one of the big things is who's donating to the campaign. I think for a lot of people, I heard personally from a lot of folks that when the Lake Erie Bill of Rights issue was put to a vote, especially when people found out that there was just this one big corporate donor, that certainly impacted how people felt about the issue because they saw kind of the David and Goliath thing play out. One notable donor. Sometimes if you look through campaign finance reports, who's Randy Ostra and Barb Petty from ProMedica donating to? Those are questions you have to ask. Okay. The blocks, John Robinson Block, the people who run the Blade, who do they donate to? Because they do cut checks to local candidates. So sometimes notable people in the press or in larger businesses might be donating. And sometimes it's not even, you may not recognize the name, but if you look at the address, you say, wait a minute, this candidate's got a lot of donations from Michigan and California, and they're running for city council here. What's that about? It's not illegal for somebody from California to cut checks to a city council candidate, as an example, in Toledo. But certainly if there was a glut of out-of-town money coming in to support a candidate who's usually going to be running on a, hey, I'm local platform, it could be used to make them look like, well, they don't really represent us because none of the money's coming from here. There are candidates here locally that will receive about 90% of their money from labor unions and very little from actual individuals. You know, so there are people who obviously have that as an interest that they're serving. Those are things that a lot of people like to know about. You can also look at things like who's Columbia Gas donating to? Okay. First Energy, which is based in Akron, Ohio. Every few months, they'll donate about $5,000 to both the Summit County Republican Party and the Summit County Democratic Party. So those parties got a lot of money in their accounts because they happen to share a residency with one of the larger corporations in the state. And all that's out there for the public to know. First Energy does have a PAC and they donate to people. The realtors have a PAC and they donate to people. Who are the special interest groups and who are they lining up behind, even if they aren't doing public proclamations of endorsement? That kind of information can be really helpful. It's also helpful to know where they're spending their money on. Sometimes you can tell who's, especially in races for mayor, you will see donations from individuals who are likely to receive an appointment for a director position. So, oh, this person's likely, they used to be the director of neighborhoods, so they're donating to candidate X, so you might, and they're donating substantive amounts. They might be doing it in the hopes that that candidate gets elected and turns around, fires the Department of Neighborhoods and puts them in. That happens more often than you think. There are certain figures in town who are very politically connected and kind of go in and out of jobs in government. Look at who they're donating to, who they're lining up behind. Not all of that is always public information. But a lot of that information is stuff people in the public, I think, want to know. And if you're if you're a journalist just trying to get information out to people about where things seem to be moving and what interests are lining up where, going through campaign finance reports and just looking at the expenditures and the donations can make a world of difference. It can be incredibly informative, it can cut through a lot of layers, and surprisingly, especially because of cutbacks and the shrinking of the journalism industry, I have been finding things that aren't being covered by anybody. And if I find something big enough, I'll usually tip off one of the reporters, but sometimes it's like, they just don't have the newsrooms that they used to. So it's kind of becoming more on us as citizens to look this information up, to know what to look up, to know how to look at these forums and make sense of them, and how to point the finger and get the word out about what candidates are doing what. So,
Sean?
yeah.
Does the campaign forum database, can you put in a keyword, say BP or something like that, and it pops up and shows anybody?
On the state level, if you go to the Secretary of State's website for the statewide PACs, a lot of times their search field, if you're like, I don't know what First Energy calls their PAC, but if I type in First Energy, they'll come back with like, here are the results that match that.
Okay.
And then you can usually look in theirs, for example, locally.
Oh,
So that's one way to do it. Instead of combing through every council person's thing looking for it, we'll just go right to First Energy's campaign finance reports, look at who their expenditures go to, and look for its Toledo address.
okay, cool.
That kind of thing. So, question?
Yeah, so I got my notice today about the semi-annual report.
Yep.
So then I file that one, and then I would file one either pre-primary and post-primary, and then also pre-general and post-general.
All right, so let's talk, you're working on a city council district election, right? So your candidate's going to be on the primary election, and let's hope on the general election as well. So what's going to happen here is you filed your designation of treasurer form, correct? So you exist as a campaign and you've raised some money, correct? So what you're going to do is you will file a semi-annual, and then when the primary comes around, it's your choice whether you want to do the pre-primary or the post-primary. You get to pick which one. And some campaigns will strategically, like in the case of Toledo Jobs and Growth Coalition, I think they knew if they filed a pre-special and it came out just before the election, and it was public knowledge that this is just one big corporate donor posing as a big coalition of all these interests, that might look bad on them. So they chose to do the post-general. So a lot of campaigns will choose to do after the election just to try to avoid getting information out to their opponents. A lot of people choose to do that, but it's your choice. And then if you make it general, you get to choose pre-general or post-general. But then if your campaign account remains open after the election, you're going to file the annual come January 2020. Again, double check with the Board of Elections on everything I say, just so that you're absolutely sure and you hear right from the horse's mouth, because they're the ones who ultimately are going to make decisions. But generally, that's what you're expected to file. Other questions? Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming. I hope this has been, I can just go to YouTube, I'm busy. But, certainly if there's bigger things I think have universal appeal. I don't want to spread myself too thin, because again, I'm involved with things and I like to go through campaign finance reports and find interesting things to publicize. I don't want to screw myself over by being like, yeah, just call me with whatever, with any question ever you ever. Like, I don't want to go.
Well, that's why I was saying a contained amount of time.
In general, if people have questions, you can feel free to reach out to me. I'll just be honest with you about whether I feel I can help you or not. A lot of times if I'm on Facebook, I have an email address. I won't give you my phone number, that's probably. But maybe if you're friendly enough and buy me a pizza or something. But in general, I'm happy to help people. And really what I'm interested in is more kind of sessions like this that we can record and put out there, because I do think that that would be useful. And then anybody who wants to run for office could just go on YouTube and get a little bit of that. Feel more confident.
Helpful, like about 2 months ago.
Well, better late than never, right? I think one of my favorite aphorisms is the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, but the second best time is today.
I just want to say I really appreciate this. I'm a new treasurer, and there's no real good information on how to just start.
Did you think this was good?
Yes, absolutely.
You're not just saying that?
No, it's very good.
I'm glad, because I remember when I was first treasurer, I was in the exact same boat. I've been at so many times where it's like, why isn't there just anything where people took the time to explain this in kind of layman's terms and walk through the practical ins and outs? Because, yeah, they'll give you a campaign finance handbook that you can sift through, but it's so bureaucratic.
No, absolutely.
And even the Board of Elections is like,
It's nice to have just sort of easy one-on-one getting into this and
right.
for more people more.
Is there a 102 class?
How to cheat campaign finance. I mean, you pretty much saw it. What a lot of candidates will do is basically commit laundering by saying, oh yeah, it's miscellaneous donations under $25, prove me wrong. I mean, nobody's going to put in the work. I mean, the reality is these are good as a baseline to get things started, but there's so many ways to go about them, and there's very little actual enforcement. They're not going to send a cop out to investigate this stuff, right? Now, a lot of this is kind of Scout's honor, which is unfortunate. We should be able to have more dependable information. But part of why I want to do this is to illustrate, look, it's not that hard to be above board, to do it the right way. And I think we'd be better as a society if we depended on people to be honest and to record this information and put it out there. I really value the transparency we get from campaign finance reports, and I want to see people keep doing them and doing them right, because I think we all benefit as a society when we can see what's really driving it, who the real grassroots candidates are versus the people who are just getting bankrolled by some group, you know, that kind of thing. Debbie?
I just was, what YouTube channel?
Probably my personal one. Like and subscribe. No, I don't. I don't do anything really. I have a YouTube account, but it's just going to be on YouTube. And what I'm going to do is when I upload it, I'm going to post a link in the event page. So if you are on the Facebook event page, you'll get a notification that this was posted. You can get it from there. Or if you email me or just reach out, you'll probably be able to like Google search Campaign Finance Workshop Toledo, and it'll probably come up. But yeah, that's pretty much it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you so much for being interested in what